Good evening once again.
Yeah, good evening, sir.
Today we have come to continue what we started last week. Last week, we were taking through the qualitative aspect, the research methods, and we have looked at a whole lot of issues with engaging questions that have prompted a lot of insightful discussions. Today, we want to continue with the quantitative aspect. And as we are presenting on the quantitative aspect, there will be issues about the quantitative methodology itself, the designs that are involved. And while the presentation is going on under each of the designs, there will be issues about how to determine the sample size, how to also sample from the population when you know your sample size, and also what are some of the analysis techniques that you can employ under the designs. So starting, the quantitative research is a methodology, as we know from the beginning. This means that instead of looking at things from a subjective point of view where each and every individual have their own understanding of the world or things that are happening around us, the quantitative aspect says that things are objective. It means there is no two ways about looking at something. You have to be objective in reporting. So in collecting your data, you report the data as it is. Also, the findings from the quantitative research, we use them to predict, to explain our phenomenon, and also to confirm findings. And in this case, there are some issues that align with the quantitative aspect of the research. And these issues form part of the design to be used, the test and measurement procedures, and the statistical analysis, as I said from the beginning. So here, the test and measurement procedures will talk about the sampling, the data collection procedures, the data collection, the modes of data collection and all that, and how some of those things are analyzed. We will not go deep into the analysis because we would have a session where we will take each and everyone through the analysis where there will be displays of how to run this statistical analysis. So in starting, when we come to the quantitative research designs, categorically or generally, there are three. We have the descriptive, the experimental, and the causal comparative. Starting with the descriptive. In this case, we want to just look at a particular sample or a population. In some cases, your sample becomes the population. So we focus on this sample and want to see what are the characteristics of this population. How best can we accurately explain or describe these characteristics? For example, if we want to see the purchasing behavior of students in terms of data usage, so we want to see how students purchase data for their academic work. In this case, the data we are going to collect will help us to describe the behavior of the students. It will help us know how much students spend on data. It will help us know for how long students use data. So in this case, we are only describing a particular phenomenon. Also, Dullock says that when there is the need to capture the characteristics of a population in a way so as to discover meaning or the frequency of certain events. So for how long has this thing been happening? To what extent is it happening? We use the descriptive research. Also, when the researcher wants to just understand the relationship between variables and to answer some questions which relate to the ongoing event, we try and just describe the relationship that is going on or the relationship between the variables of a particular sample. Again, with the descriptive designs, we are saying that we have types. One type is the descriptive observational design. In this case, all what the researcher does is to observe what is happening around or among a particular sample. So when we come into the students' domain, University of Cape Coast students, we want to see when a lecture is 6:30, how long does it take students to even come for lectures and settle? Here, you can go to the lecture venue with your notes and everything and just observe from 6:30, how many minutes from there would the actual lecture start, depending on how fast students settle for the class. So this is an observational design. In this case, you only observe and do not intervene in the study. You only observe what is happening and write your findings. Again, we also have the descriptive correlational design. Here we want to see what is the relationship between two variables. Someone will say, is it always the case that it is two variables? No, but yes. The no is that even if we have 6 variables and we are looking at the relationship among them, at the end of the day, we are going to compare only 2 of these variables at a time. That is why the relationship is established between 2 variables. So in this case, you can decide to see what is the relationship between student study time and their performance, academic performance. Here, the prudent thing to do is to use the correlational design so that you can describe the relationship that is happening between the amount of time students spend in learning and their performance. This does not mean that the amount of time they spend causes either an increase or decrease in their performance. You are just only saying what is the relationship, not a cause and effect. Again, descriptive designs come in the form of surveys. And the surveys, that's what most of us do, especially for educational research. So for surveys, we have 2 types, the cross-sectional and then the longitudinal. Our main discussion will be on the survey designs so that we go into details how these surveys are used for research, data collection, data analysis, and reporting of findings. So with a cross-sectional survey, data is collected at one point in time. One point in time does not mean that you collect the data today and that is the end. What it means is that from your sample, you only collect the data once. You will see some people's data collection spanning from maybe January to February. It is still cross-sectional because the researcher is not following these people and collecting data from time to time to see the changes in their behavior. But maybe you are collecting data from the 10 senior high schools in the Cape Coast metropolis. So today you decide to go to Infantine, you collect the data. Next week you decide to go to Infantine. Next week you go to Adisco. So all these things is just a cross-sectional survey because at one point in time you are collecting data, but you are not following a particular sample, collecting data to see what is happening in their lives. The next thing we'll focus on is the longitudinal study. So in this case, you see that the data is collected at different points in time in order to study changes over time. So we have, you came to school, yes, so let's say from your level 100. Then we want to see how you develop attitude towards learning over the course of your study. That is the 4 years. So someone is studying you, observing you, collecting data from you at every point in time to see from this stage to this stage, what is your attitude towards learning? from this stage to this stage, what is the attitude? So when some of these things are happening, we say you are conducting a longitudinal survey. Sometimes you see we present designs and they ask you a question. Oh, you are using descriptive design, and they ask, what type of descriptive design are you using? Then there is an issue. So today, I want to let you know that even in the descriptive design that you are using, we have types. And especially when you are doing the survey, under the survey too, we have types, and they all depend on what you want to do. Mostly, I'll be talking about how data is collected. That is one main thing I use to differentiate between these particular designs for quantitative research. Under longitudinal study, is it always the case that one individual or a group of individuals are observed or are studied over some period of time? The answer is no. We will look at that. Under longitudinal study, you can decide to do a trend analysis. This is where data from national surveys are analyzed to observe changes, for example, in student performance over time. So as I gave the first example, you came to level 100, your data is being collected for academic performance level 100, level 200, level 300, level 400. When you do something like this, it's called a trend studies, because for one individual, as a student, you are collecting data from one individual over time. Another issue can be our WASI or BEC results. So for the past 5 years, how are students' performance over the past 5 years? Data here, you see, is not collected from just one individual. We have different sections of the student. So 2015 batch, 2016 batch, 2017 batch, 2018 batch. In this case, the whole student population, that is SHS students, have become your population. And we are just collecting their performance over time. So this batch, what was their performance? What was their performance? Then we now do a trend analysis and compare their performance to see how their performance are changing over time. So some people will say, in this kind of survey, you have the same population, but their sample is changing over time, whereas you are collecting data on the same phenomenon. Good. Again, there's another aspect of the longitudinal study, that is the cohort studies. In this case, you follow a group of individuals, for example, with a family history of, let's say, heart disease, to observe the occurrence of heart disease over time. So when you look at this, you see that these particular individuals are not changing. If it is 6 months you are going to do the survey, you will follow these same individuals over the 6 months period to determine how their heart disease is occurring, is diminishing, whatever that is happening in their life pertaining to the phenomenon. Again, there is the issue about panel studies. So in this case, we repeatedly measure a group of consumers' attitude towards a particular brand to observe changes in their brand loyalty over time. So here, we don't change the individuals. In this case, I think there is some literature on it that will say that for this design, the researcher surveys the same sample of individuals at different times during the course of the survey. So let's talk about still data usage. In January, what was the data usage for these people? February, March, April. So the same information is being gotten from the same group of consumers, but that information is being repeatedly collected over a specific number of times so that we can now see at the end of the day, how loyal are these people to what they are consuming? Now, in the qualitative study, we spoke about modes of data collection. The quantitative study also makes use of what? Data collection modes. One of the modes we talk about is the direct administration of questionnaires. For this stage, I want to assume that almost all of us have heard about questionnaires before and what questionnaires mean. In designing questionnaires, either you go there in person. So those that have been doing observational, those that have been doing educational research most of the times, we go to the schools ourselves and distribute or administer the questionnaires to the people. In that case, your presence is there. The people fill your questionnaire, you take it and you go. Another way is personal interviews. Even though we know that in nature, interviews are for qualitative studies, but there is the case that you use interviews for even quantitative studies. In this case, you know the type of interview structure that you are going to use. Later on, we'll look at what type of interview structure that helps us to collect quantitative data. So it's not all the case that interviews will help us collect qualitative data. Then we have mail surveys. If I want to explore a particular phenomenon about a sample that I don't have direct personal contact with, I can ask these people to send me their mails or get the mails of these people, then design or develop my study instrument into a mail survey or into a survey and send it into their mails. Wherever they are, they will be able to respond and I will get their feedback. Another one is telephone interviews or telephone calls. You will see you're on the phone with someone who is trying to collect data, asking you questions with a protocol. So whatever information you are giving, the person is taking or putting down some notes. Sometimes it depends on how you are going to analyze this information that shows either you are doing a quantitative or qualitative study. Then what are some of the types of instruments, looking at the modes of data collection, what are some of the types of instruments we use to collect data when it comes to quantitative, when it comes to descriptive research designs? The first one is the questionnaire. As we have said, closed-ended or open-ended. A closed-ended questionnaire limits your respondents to give you information that is predefined for them. So the closed-ended questionnaires make use of leakage scale types of questionnaires. So for example, you want to see individuals' agreement or disagreement on a particular issue or situation. So you design the interview guide, you design the questionnaire, and then you have structures for them. You either select disagree, strongly disagree, agree, or strongly agree. In this case, the respondents cannot give you any feedback or any information that you have not specified for them. You have limited them into responding in a way that you think is best suited for your work. And there is another one, also the open-ended. Here, you give the chance to the individuals. They state their opinions, they write whatever they want to write. You pick the data, come back, sit down, look at the themes in it, and you can even analyze that quantitatively. Now, there's the issue about the interviews. So let's take the telephone, for example. I could have a structured interview guide with questions. These questions are predefined. So when I ask and then you respond, I don't ask further questions. I don't ask probing questions because I don't give you the chance to give me information that I don't need. All I need is I have a structure, I have a protocol that I am following. Let's stay within lane. Just as the semi-structured, even though not too much space is given to the individuals to respond or to state their own interpretation or their own view about your phenomenon, you still limit them to some extent that they don't go outside. So innately, interviews are for qualitative, but depending on what you are doing in the quantitative study, you can use interview guides. In some cases, the information you get from the interview guide, you don't analyze it qualitatively. You use descriptives, mean, standard deviation, percentages and frequencies, and that shows that even though you have collected the data using interview guides, you are going to analyze it quantitatively. The other aspect of the quantitative research you want to look at is the experimental research. So with experimental research, in this case, the researcher investigates a treatment of an intervention into a group. You call that a study group, and then at the end of the day, you measure the outcomes of the treatment. So for example, we want to see how effective is a particular teaching approach. So in this case, doing a quantitative work, and for that matter, an experimental study, you have to introduce this particular teaching method into a study group, because without some of these experiments, it is very difficult to know the effectiveness. And without the people experiencing your intervention, it is very difficult for them to tell you how effective it is. You can even go there with questionnaires, with surveys and all that. If they have not experienced what you are introducing, it becomes very difficult for them to tell you how effective it is. And you yourself, you cannot even know how effective it is unless you get what? An intervention to see what are the changes that this intervention is bringing in the behavior of individuals. In that case, when we are doing an experimental research, we will need a treatment or experimental group. We also need a group that we can control. We will need a pretest, even though not in all cases. Then the intervention itself, after which you collect a post-test. So let's see how this thing is aligned. In each case of an experimental research, you would have to use a sample from a population. As I said from the beginning, sometimes our population becomes our sample. But in each case of experimental research, there is going to be that issue of selection and assigning of your sample into two groups. So from the left-hand side, you could see we have two groups, a treatment or experimental group and that of a control group. But who goes into a treatment group and who goes into a control group? That is why we need some form of selection or assigning. That's why the die is here. In these two groups, one is the treatment and another one is the control group. In the treatment group or the experimental group, you would have to introduce the intervention, and that intervention that you introduce becomes the new treatment you are giving to the group. Now, when you come to the control group, even though you would have a treatment for them, but that is not the intervention you are measuring. For example, when it comes to educational research, we want to see how the lecture method, okay, let me use an intervention that is very innovative. You want to see how the use of technology to teach influences students' attitude or experience in that particular course. So we have two groups of students. Those that you, the researcher, you teach them using technology. And those that you teach them using the normal, conventional approach, the lecture method, the teacher-centered and all that. Because at the end of the day, when it comes to this educational research, the issue is we always want to see the new intervention we are bringing, how comparable it is to the old ways of doing things. That is why with one group, you don't interject the intervention into them. But what do? You still give them the old treatment. At the end of the experiment, you come out with an outcome. Then we can now compare and know the effectiveness of these interventions. So, just as we have seen for the descriptive design, where we have several examples, several types and all that, we still have the same for experimental research. One, in experimental research, we want to address selection bias. I cannot just look at, or you, the researcher, because some people have to go into a treatment group and some have to be classified into a control group. You cannot just look at the faces of these individuals and say, you have qualified to be in the control group, you are not qualified to be in the control group. So how do we address these issues of bias? We have to do randomization. So one, we have a random selection. Now in this random selection, this determines who takes part in your study or not. And who takes part in your study is not the same as who goes into experimental group, who goes into a control group. Just as you always select individuals from a population to take part in your study, when you are doing experimental research, all those things also apply. So with the random selection, we have several ways of selecting participants. If we have a large population that we are supposed to select from, in this case, there are several approaches. We have the Yamane's formula, we have the Cressy and Morgan table of random numbers, we have a lot. These approaches will let you know if from a sample of 100, how many are being used for the study. After you have gotten that 100, let's say 60 from the 100, now the issue about random assignment or random placement comes to play. In those 60 people, who goes into the experimental group and who goes into the control group? So here you are no longer doing a sample selection, but you are doing a random assignment or random placement. So in detailed terms, random selection is the process of recruiting or selecting your research participant into the study. A random assignment or random placement has to do about categorizing your sample that you have selected into either a control or an experimental group. Now, we've been hearing about designs being blueprints. One of the specific blueprints that we normally look out for in experimental research is how data is collected and how hypotheses are tested. So these blueprints enable you to collect data and test hypotheses. But how are those things done? One way of collecting data, bringing an intervention and testing a hypothesis is through the true experimental research designs. Experts say that this kind of research designs normally happen or normally take place when you have a large sample who are not pre-categorized. So in this case, there is the issue of random selection or random assignment. When we come to UCC and we want to see how the Moodle platform, that's the e-learning platform designed for the school, how it affects students' test-taking attitude. You know, we take quizzes face-to-face, but with the Moodle, there are options that sometimes quizzes are held on the e-learning platform. So here, that Moodle they are bringing into the system become the intervention. You see, the number of UCC students are large. We cannot just say these people should be used for it or these people should not be used. We have to do a random selection where we give equal chance to each student to be selected in the study. So after this selection, then which students go into a random group, a control group, and which of them go into an experimental group? That's why we do the random assignment. And in this case, we are saying that the random assignment is at the individual level. So when you select a student, how does the student be placed in a control or experimental group? Then there is the issue of quasi-experimental research designs. In the quasi-experimental research designs, there is, I want to be careful here because people say that there is no random selection, but there is random assignment. And they base on the issue of randomization to categorize between true experimental designs and quasi-experimental designs. But literature will tell you that it is not always the case that in quasi-experimental, there is no random selection. The reason why I'm saying this is that even before you select your predefined categorized groups to know which of the group goes into experimental and who goes into control group, sometimes there is the issue of random selection. Let's see how it plays out. For example, we want to see the effect of the new curriculum on students' performance. So there are 10 schools, but because it's an experimental research, we cannot use all the 10 schools. We have to select from the 10 schools, test the curriculum on some schools and see how it affects the student performance. Then we can now make a conclusion, either to generalize it over the whole population or not. In this case, these schools that will take part in your experiment are supposed to be randomly selected. So in this case, there is random selection. But what if, GS categorizes schools into either grade A, grade B, grade C, grade D. And in a particular district, we could see that, grade C schools there are 2. But possibly our work we are doing is about grade C schools. In this case, you select the 2 schools without using any random selection. After selecting, then you know which of the schools are randomly assigned to a group and which of the schools are randomly assigned to the other group. So it is not all the cases that when it comes to quasi-experimental research, there is no random selection. And again, here the random assignment is at the group level. So in this case, if we select a particular group of students, we are not going to select individuals from those schools and classify them into the control or experimental. In this case, we are going to classify the whole group into either a control or experimental. That is why from expert analysis, random assignment in quasi-experimental research is at the group level, whereas random assignment at the true experimental research is at the individual level. Again, we are now coming to take those experimental research designs one by one. First is the true experimental research design. And we've said a lot about it, where there is random assignment, random selection, and all that. But there is one type of true experimental research design called pre-test, post-test control group design. The reason why we are doing this is that in writing on your research designs in your thesis, you don't just say, I am using an experimental research design. The question is, what type of experimental research design are you using? Then, why are you going that angle? Why are you using that particular experimental research design? Depending on what you are looking for, your phenomenon, what your research is all about, that will let you know whether I am using true experimental or quasi-experimental. If it is true, which type of the true experimental design are you using? One is the pre-test, post-test, as the name suggested. So looking at the diagram, there is a random allocation, which is the same as random assignment. So after selecting your students, then you assign some students to the treatment group and others to the control group. The first thing that happens in the pre-test, post-test design is one, you collect a pre-intervention measurement. That is pre-testing or collecting pre-information about your participants before the intervention. So you collect data before and after. But whatever happens between before and the after is the intervention that you have brought forward or the intervention that you are interjecting into your treatment group. In this case, the intervention means the new approach you are bringing. And that is the treatment group that takes that intervention over a period of time, because all these things are time bound. Then you adjust for your control group using the old approach. We'll look at some situations where the control group is not even touched. After your intervention or whatsoever you want to do, there is the need to collect what? A post-test. So that is information about the student after the intervention. So just as the instance I gave, the effect of test-taking behavior, the effect of the Moodle platform, that is the e-learning, on the test-taking behavior of UCC students. So in this case, first of all, we would collect data on test-taking behavior of the students. Then we introduce some of the students to take tests using the e-learning platform, that is the treatment group, and some of the students to take another test using what? The face-to-face way. Then after all this, we now collect data on their test-taking behavior again, both for the treatment group and for the control group. You can decide to compare some of these data that you have collected to see if there is any difference in their test-taking behavior. So the issue about data analysis comes in. So if we are comparing these groups, first of all, with the treatment group, if we look at their initial test-taking behavior, then they are introduced to the e-learning test-taking, then we collect data after their test-taking. When we compare the before and after behavior, how do we analyze this? When we want to look at the test-taking behavior of the treatment group and the control group after the intervention, how do we analyze this? In the case where you want to compare the test-taking behavior of the treatment group before and after they have they have been introduced to the Moodle platform, we use the paired sample t-test. This one is going to compare the same group on two different tests. And the first test is for the pre-test, the second test is the post-test. So when you are comparing the same group or the same sample on two different groups, we do the paired sample t-test. Again, when we are now looking at the treatment group and the control group, how are their test-taking behaviors changed over time as a result of the intervention? we compare the two using the independent sample t-test to see whether there are differences in their test-taking behaviors after your intervention. The next one is the post-test only control group design. So in this case, let's assume everything in the pre-test, post-test design is intact, except that here, before the intervention, there's no pre-testing. We didn't collect any data on their entry behavior or their first view or opinions or perception whatsoever. No data was collected. But we only went to conduct the intervention. So with this intervention, after we are done with the intervention or the experiment, then you collect data, that is your post-test data. Then you can now analyze these post-tests to see whether there are differences in the treatment group or the control group. And all these things, there should be the need for you to do a random assignment, who goes into the treatment group and who goes into the control group, so that we can minimize selection bias. The next one we'll look at is the Solomon 4 group designs. In the Solomon 4 group, some people say it combines all aspects of the pre-test, post-test, and the post-test only design. Why is this so? Here, there are 4 groups. One group is the control, another group is the experimental group. But don't forget that you can only have an experimental and a control group. But in the Solomon 4 group design, we have 2 experimental groups and 2 control groups. In this case, we want to see all other issues about errors, about biases, about intervention bias. How best can they be controlled? So there is one group, let's start with the treatment group, that you would have to collect a pre-test, do an intervention, and collect a post-test. We know what that is. That is already the pre-test, post-test design. And there is the control group where you collect pre-test, take them through the old approach, and collect a post-test. Then there is another experimental group where there is no pre-test. You go straight with your intervention and collect a post-test. That one combines only the post-test only procedure or design. Then there is one control group that in this group too, you don't collect any pre-test. You only go through the conventional approach or conventional way and you collect your post-test. So any issue about biases, issue about, specifically it's about the biases. And then some of these biases are of very much essence to researchers. One, the difference that is occurring in the post behavior of your participant. Is it as a result of your treatment, or there are other variables that can be of importance that are affecting your post-intervention behavior? When you go to the pre-test, you will see that some of those variables are not being controlled for. When you come to the pre-test, the post-test only design to, some of those variables are not being controlled. So researchers came up with the idea that if there will be biases in some of these designs, why not control for all this in one study using another design called the Solomon 4 group design? So the whole idea about the true experimental design is that there is always a random selection and there is always a random assignment. We'll look at all those things that happen between your pre-testing and the post-test and see how it affects your test results. But before that, let's look at the quasi-experimental. In this case, when it is not sometimes possible or ethical to randomly select your participants for the study, as I made the example with the grade C schools, where there are only 2 grade C schools that you have to use, because it's an experimental research, there needs to be a control group and there needs to be an experimental group. So in this case, there is no random selection of these 2 groups. They are there already pre-existing and predefined, pre-categorized. You take them and now you can only do a random placement into either a control or experimental group. Again, why do we do quasi-experimental designs, or why would someone say, I want to use this design? This design is possible for school-based experimental research because of the use of intact classes. Those that teach and those that do educational research, they will understand this better. The intact classes means that when I go into these schools, you know, we have courses that we run at all those schools. One of the interesting aspects of this design, especially when it is school-based, is that it is unethical to some extent to be comparing the performance of maybe science students to, excuse me to say, visual art students on some phenomenon. So in this case, researchers state that to be fair and ethical to everybody, when you are going into these schools, select a course or a program that is similar to all these schools. So if it is visual students you are going to use for your intervention, you use visual student for the control and the treatment. For school A, for school B. If it is home economics student, for school A, for school B. But when you get into those schools, there are classes. And you know, nowadays, our schools classify the classes based on students' performances. So we have maybe visual arts 2A. They are the best visual arts class. Visual art 2B, moderately performing. Visual art 2C, in that decreasing manner. So when it happens like this, you can only go and use a visual art 2A class. And when you are using that visual art 2K class, it becomes what? An intact class. You are not bringing in any new participants to come and disrupt the class. You are using the class as it is. So that is why when you are going to do a research like that, that involves the use of intact classes, it is better to use the quasi-experimental research design. Again, there is the use of intact classes or samples, as I have said. So we also have types of quasi-experimental designs, and one is the non-equivalent dependent variable design. In this case, there are 2 different dependent variables which you are using to measure the effect of the experimental treatment. So for example, you want to teach some certain students using a new technology, but you are interested in how this new technology affects the students' performance and their interests. So in this case, you see that your dependent variable is not one, or it's not the same. You have interest and then you have their achievement. So because these dependent variables are not the same, but it is the same experimental treatment that you are going to interject into your treatment group to get how it affects these 2 variables, you will see your variables are not equivalent. So you have the non-equivalent dependent variable design. Again, when you have the non-equivalent groups, in this case, you see that your study samples are assigned to the experimental control group based on some pre-existing characteristics. So in one case, we want to see the effect of an intervention or how males and females differ on a particular intervention. So our main focus is about males. So all males are in the experimental group and all females are in the control group. When something like this happens, your groups that you are using are not equivalent. They are not the same. Sometimes people make the assumption about sample sizes. It is not always the case that your male's sample size will be the same as the female sample size. And because you are now looking at the characteristics of an individual, before you place them into either a control or an experimental, there is always the issue about what? Selection bias. In as much as we look at the true experimental, and in this case, we don't look at the characteristics of an individual before we put them into either a control or an experimental. In the non-equivalent quasi-experimental design, there is that issue about looking at the characteristics of an individual before we know whether you'll be placed into a control or experimental. One issue is about smokers and non-smokers. So we want to see when we interject smoking of a particular brand of cigarettes, how it affects the development of lung cancer. So there are some groups of people who are already smokers. They will be treated into an experimental group. And those who are not smokers will not be put into an experimental group, but a control group. Even though these people have different characteristics, you will see that we are putting all smokers into one group, and there could be issues about some of these placement and assignment. Unlike when we come to students, we don't have any pre-knowledge about the students as in their characteristics. So because of your characteristic, go into the experimental group and go into the control group. In this case, we look at the characteristics of the individuals before we assign them to the groups, and that brings the issue about selection bias. The next one to look for is the pre-test, post-test design. And in this all case, I always say that the main issue to look out for in the quasi-experimental are the non-equivalent dependent and the non-equivalent groups. So the variable and the groups, because in each case, you can decide to do a pre-test, post-test design. You can decide to do a post-test polling design. You can decide to do a Solomon 4 group design. So yeah, the selection of the participants for your study is the most important aspect here, where your assignment is based on what? The group, but not the individuals. But when you come to the non-equivalent, your assignment is also based on which group of people are going to receive the treatment and which group of people are not going to receive the treatment. So what are issues of internal validity? I mean, issues about validity in experimental research. As you are bringing in your intervention, you are always asking yourself one question. Is this the case that whatever post-test behavior I observe from my study participant, is it based on the intervention I have given them or not? If it is not based on the intervention again, what are some of the factors that can influence their behavior after my intervention? And also, the people that you have used for your study, how well or how justified is your result to be generalized over a particular group of people? So you pick some sections of UCC students and you bring them the e-learning. At the end of the day, you are now asking yourself, how can I generalize this over the whole student's population? Am I going to get the same result or not? So that is the issue about validity in experimental research. The first one is the internal validity. So the observed differences or the observed change in the behavior of your individuals at the end of your treatment, is it as a result of other variables, let's say extraneous or confounding variables? For example, You gave a group of students a pre-test before you introduce an intervention. Is it the case that when you are coming to collect your post-test, your pre-test you have given that has given them a pre-informed idea about what you are measuring, so that will influence their post-test behavior, but not your intervention? So that question lingers. And to what extent can you control for some of these variables so that you can objectively see the influence of your intervention? Another one too is the external validity. So when you use a sample from a population, how can you generalize your study findings over a particular population? Again, the settings that you use to conduct the study, how well or how porous are these settings that it gives you a pathway to be able to generalize your findings over a particular group of people? Then your treatment variables, to what extent did it affect those that you have used in your study? Is it the case that when that treatment variable goes out to your population or your sample that are not part of your study, is it the case that it is going to have the same influence on them? So we look at all of these things. Now, from the presentation, you could see that there are a lot of issues that can affect your internal validity, because internal validity itself talks about the differences that have occurred in the performance or in the behavior of your sample after your intervention. Is it the case that those differences are as a result of your intervention? If that question lingers, then what are some of those factors that affect this? The first one is history. And history talks about the events that are occurring between the first and the second measurement. So your pre-test and your post-test, in addition to the experimental variable, okay? This might affect your measurement. Sometimes when we are in school and they bring us questionnaires, or someone is coming to do an experimental work, we know that from our pre-test, it's likely that the post-test will also be the same questions or similar questions. Then quickly you go look for answers to those questions and you are ready for the post-test. But whatever performance or behavior you exhibit on that post-test, you will see that it is your preparedness for the post-test as a result of your pre-test. Anything that has happened between the intervention and your pre-test are what caused changes, but not the intervention itself that has caused a change. So as a researcher, you need to be mindful about some of these things. Another one too is the maturation. So the process of maturing, which takes place in the individual during the duration of the experiment, which is not a result of specific events, but of what? Simply growing older or growing more tired or similar changes. So how knowledgeable does someone become before you even collect your data? Growth in knowledge. If you are doing, let's say, you are studying the development of lung cancer in some individuals. You know, lung cancer comes, sometimes is associated with age and all that, and how quickly individuals develop that. So is this the case that the age of the individuals is what is affecting their development of that particular disease by the end of your study? This is something to take into consideration. Again, the issue about pre-testing, we spoke about that. Then also measuring instruments. So there could be changes in instruments. There could be calibration of instruments, difference in the observers, and also the scorers. So this normally happens when you are looking at performance of students. So one person graded the pre-test and another person is grading the post-test. You see that we have differences in grading of result, in, let's say, in marking students' result. There are some people who are so mean and there are some people who are very open. If you don't use only one person to grade both the pre-test and the post-test, the result you get in your post-test and the result you get in the pre-test, even though there are differences, it might be as a result of a grading, but not your intervention. Then we also look at differential selection. And this differential selection, we talk about different groups of individuals. And these people would have had different previous knowledge or ability, which will affect the final measurement. So you have to take these things into consideration. How different are the people when it comes to their knowledge level? Is it the reality is that the ideal is saying you have to take these things into consideration, but the reality is that you as the researcher, it is sometimes difficult for you to determine some of these things while you are conducting the study. But there's always a way out. We'll look at all those ways. One, the experimental mortality. So death of an individual who is taking part in the experiment. So you will see that your pre-test might have the results for that person, but during the experiment, that person is no longer there. So the person will not have a post-test score. If there are differences in the scores, is the death of the person the issue or it is your intervention? So that's why we also need to take this into consideration. Then those factors that are affecting the external validity, we talk about pre-testing. So after your pre-test, how do you generalize your findings at the end of your experiment over a particular population? Then you have, in this case, you see individuals who were pre-tested might be less or more sensitive to the experiment variable, or might have learned from the pre-test, making them unrepresentative of the population. So something like this, when after your intervention, you see that, oh, well, these people show knowledge or high levels of knowledge on my intervention, then let me generalize this over the whole population. Is that always, I mean, you will see in this case that there is something wrong. Okay, so as a researcher, you have to take all these things into consideration. The issue about differential selection, we spoke about it. The issue about experimental procedures. So experimental procedures, you could see that some of the procedures have a certain amount of effect on the subject in the experimental setting. So the effect that it has on them, is that the same effect it will have when someone who is not part of your study, but you introduce that to the person? Because some people are susceptible to some interventions, maybe they are allergic or something. Then all of a sudden you introduce the intervention, then it takes quick effect on them. Is it the case that when you go outside there, that intervention will have that quick effect on the people? So we have to take all these things into consideration. Sometimes when it comes to development of drugs, vaccines, you cannot joke around with these factors because they are very important, else you'll kill a whole population. Then how do we control for some of these issues about validity? How do we control them? Here, there should be a pretest. We have seen that one pretest itself is an issue, or it's one of the issues that contribute to jeopardizing the validity or affecting the validity of the experiment. But we are also saying that pre-test can also be used to control and then make sure you have a valid experiment. How is this done? So the pre-test before the experiment begins, okay, can aid or control for differential selection by determining the presence or knowledge of the experimental variable before the experiment begins. So the reason why we conduct the pre-test is to know the people's entry behavior. Are these people okay? Or can I continue with my intervention looking at what these people are saying? Let's say you want to look at a particular intervention on the attitude of students. Then before you collected as you are collecting the pre-test, you analyze and you saw that no, they already have high attitudes or positive attitudes towards your phenomenon. Do you continue using those group of students? If you go through that angle, is it the case that even when there is a change in their behavior, it will be as a result of your experiment? So this is one of the reasons why we conduct pre-tests, to know the entry behavior of the individuals, whether to go on with the intervention or not. Again, there is the need for a control group. So for the control group, we say, if you're using a control group, these control groups are not exposed to the experiment. So you will see that they can help to reduce the effect of history, maturation, instrumentation, and other interaction variables. So this control group, their job is to see the issues or the differences that occur between your pre-test, the intervention, and at the end of the intervention. You see, the control group will not be taken through this new intervention. So whatever change that is occurring between this time, from the beginning of your intervention to the end, the control group is there to control for some of these factors. That is why we don't just use a control group and throw them away. We still analyze data. We'll still compare the control group in some situations to the experimental group so that we can see what are some of the differences that are occurring between these two groups of individuals. There's the issue about randomization. We spoke about randomization, random selection, random assignment, so that we can use this randomization to control for selection bias. Then there could be the addition of what? More groups. And in this case, the Solomon 4 group design becomes very important, because in the Solomon 4 group design, there are cases that you don't even collect pre-test data. So the pre-test data you collect in some experiments, you are already controlling them in another group so that you can now get the true validity of your results or of your experiment that you are introducing. Another aspect of the experimental, another aspect of the quantitative research is the causal comparative research. And in this case, it is sometimes confusing when you are talking about the descriptive correlational design and the causal comparative. One issue we have to hold along as we are going is the issue about cause and effect relationship between the groups. And causal comparative, there is no need for experiments. So in this case, you see that in a causal comparative research, you compare your groups that have different characteristics. And after you have established the facts, then you investigate the potential causal relationship between the variables. But when you're looking at the correlational design, it does not investigate the causal relationship. It only talks about what is the extent of the relationship between these two variables. But when we come to the causal comparative, we are comparing groups, but not variables. Please, let's take this into consideration. Correlational research compares variables. So what's the difference between students' attitude and their achievement? Achievement and attitude becomes the variable. But when we come to causal comparative and we want to see what is the effect of the receiving bonus, so males that receive bonus and females that, let's say, in a job setting, there are some people on incentives and there are some people not on incentives. To what extent do these incentives or non-incentive receiving affect the job satisfaction of the individuals? So in this case, we are comparing two groups. One, that is those that are on the incentive, they receive incentives. And two, those that do not receive incentives. So we want to compare these two groups and see, is there any differences in their job satisfaction? If there are differences in their job satisfaction, to what extent does the incentive, the receipt of the incentive affect their job satisfaction? So that's why the need for the causal comparative research. So you see, in this case, it is descriptive in nature though, but the idea behind it is so different from the descriptive designs we have looked at. And in this case, there is no manipulation of any variable. If it is job satisfaction, it is job satisfaction. It is predetermined, pre-existing. Incentives. You don't have to introduce some people to receiving incentives and take out incentives from people. So causal comparative is also non-experimental. Again, I've also said it. So they are non-experimental design that investigate the causal relationship among or between groups on a particular dependent variable. Again, if you try to identify the causes of differences that already exist within individual groups, individuals or groups. So let's say countries, for example, those that receive COVID grants and those that did not receive COVID grants, how are their economic performance post-COVID? So in this case, you see, you don't have to go and conduct any experiment. The relationships are already existing. The differences are already existing. Some receive a grant and some do not receive a grant. Now, looking at those differences, how does it affect their economic performance? So when do we use the causal comparative? I think for whatever I've said from the beginning, we can now say that when your variables cannot be manipulated, so in this case, there's no need for experimental or any intervention. Two, when experiments are not possible, as said earlier, and all attempts to identify the causes or consequences while the assumption of this design is inaccurate and not always true. So someone will say those that are receiving fat salaries produce well, or their work output is higher, and those that receive slim salaries, their work output is slow, just relating to their job satisfaction. Is this always the case, that those that are on higher salaries are doing everything possible to make sure their job output are at a greater level than those that do not receive higher salaries? So when some of these things in your research, you want to see, these are just mere says. To what extent does this hold for a particular group of people? Then you can conduct a causal comparative research and compare these groups of people on your area of interest. Then when there is an attempt to understand the cause and effect, does it mean that higher salaries causes high work output? So do higher salaries cause output to be high? you have to test for some of these things, and the best design to use is the causal comparative. Again, there are 3 types of causal comparative. 1, exploration of effects. So if you want to see the effect of a variable in a particular group on the other, you can use a causal comparative, as the example I have given. There are students who take extra classes, and there are students who do not take extra classes. To what extent do the taking of extra class affect students' academic performance? So in this case, you want to see how does the taking of extra class, so you are going to use what? You are going to compare groups of students who take extra class and groups of students who do not take extra class on their academic achievement to see the extent to which this affects their academic achievement. Also, when we want to explore courses, so intake of alcohol, or higher intake of alcohol causes so and so, then you can observe individuals who take alcohol and individuals who do not take alcohol over a period of time. As you are observing, at the end of the day, what conclusion do you draw on these 2 groups of individuals? We also talk about the exploration of consequences. So after looking at this area of interest, what consequences does it have for this group and that group? When we want to compare these groups of individuals, then we go ahead and use the causal comparative. And you see that in this case, there are different statistical measures to use. And the statistical measures to use when it comes to effects, causes, consequences. In some cases, you use the t-test, the independent sample t-test. In some cases, you use the chi-square test of association. Are these people associated, or what is their frequency across groups? Is it the same? Is it different on your phenomenon? Then you can also use regression analysis. To what extent do these set of variables influence so and so dependent variable? As I said from the beginning, there will be a session for the in-depth data analysis techniques so that we can demonstrate to you how these analyses take part when it comes to all aspects of research. Thank you so much for your time.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Christian. That was very insightful. We would open the floor for questions. So if you have any questions, kindly raise up your hand and you'll be called to answer. If there are any questions, kindly raise up your hand, please. Okay, so Mr. Roberts. Hello, Mr. Roberts. Kindly go on with your question, please. Hello, Mr. Roberts, can you hear me?
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you. Go on with your question.
Yeah, please. So what the presenter just presented. So what about, I think it's more of educational research. So what about those of us doing also experimental research, but not related to education? In that case, what do we do? Because we don't have anything like the pre-test and post-test. There's nothing a pre-test or post-test. You need to go to the field, get your data, and then do your analysis. So in that case, how then do you go about our own? Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Roberts. Mr. Moses. Mr. Moses, please ask your question.
Yes, please. I'm from, thank you for the opportunity. Well, some of us are from departments that we don't conduct experimental research. So I don't know if there will be opportunity for him to come on again for us to benefit, because this one actually is for those who would perform experiments. So they will have to have the control group and all that. So if he can do that another time, maybe short, a brief one, it will be okay. But my question is on the cohort study, and then the very last slide he shared with us, the causal experimental, the one he said exploring effects. If you can go to the very last slide, the examples he gives, yes, the examples he gives, they seem to be similar. I don't know if you can clarify that for me, because yes, the three types, exploration of causes. The example he gave there was if you want to study smokers or so, you would have to study them for some time. It was almost similar to the cohort study where he said, when you are studying groups of family on causes of heart diseases or so, they would seem to be similar. If you could kindly give us any explanation on that.
All right. Thank you very much. Mr. Abukari. Umar Abukari. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. Kindly ask your question.
Okay. I want to ask a question on quasi experimental design in relation to the random selection and random assignment. We said in a quasi experiment, we use the group's geometric settings. I want to find out whether when you get, in case you have large numbers in those groups, for example, I want to use UCC as experimental group and also UEW as control groups. In each of these groups, I have large numbers. When I attempt to use some of the students in each of the two universities, I'm also doing quasi experiments. That is when I tend with the numbers in their natural setting. Whether I use the random selection procedures or not. When I make attempt to tamper with the numbers, I'm doing quasi experiments. I want clarification from that.
All right. Thank you very much. So, Mr. Christian, we take this batch of questions first, and then we'll move on to the next one. Hey. Okay, so I think it looks as if Mr. Christian has a bit of problem. So let's hold on for our questions to be answered.
Okay, please, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. With the first two questions on those that are not in the area of education, and then because they don't do experimental research. From the beginning of the presentation, there was the issue about descriptive research, where you don't manipulate any variable. All you are looking for is to collect data to describe what is happening in your sample or your population. So it is not in every case that you are compelled to do an experimental research. Even in my field like this, some do experimental, some do descriptive, some do causal comparative. So if your field is not something that you need to do experimental research, don't force yourself to do it, because research, as I've always been saying, is dynamic. In as much as there are protocols to follow, you do what suits you, not what you think, not what you should always do, or you should do it no matter what. No, you do what suits your work, what suits your study, and how best you can collect data and analyze and interpret. So even though your field does not talk about anything experimental, there is the other aspect for you there to do. That is the descriptive research. And I will give examples of the types of descriptive research. You can do descriptive survey, you can do observational, you can do developmental studies and all that. Then the issue about the cohort study and the three types of the causal comparative. You see, for the cohort study, I stated that here you pick a particular group of individuals and you study them over, let's say, a long period of time, so over a period of time. And at each level or at each interval, you are collecting data. The data you are collecting is telling you whether there are differences occurring among your cohort as the time goes on. So if it is for 6 months, you want to collect data after every 1 month, you collect data on your phenomenon. After every 1 month, then you can now analyze and see what are the changes in the behavior of this cohort, these particular people that you are studying. I hope I have answered that question. Because when you come to the causal comparative, this causal comparative talks about to what extent is one variable causing the other. So influencing, affecting, impacting. To what extent does one variable impact the other? Okay, per a group. So in this case, you have 2 groups of individuals. Even though you don't do any experiment, there are always the comparison between what? 2 groups. So in the first group and the second group, one has something the other do not have. As I said about incentives and job satisfaction. So you will see that you can only get the extent to which the incentives influence the job satisfaction when you compare those that have incentives and those that do not have incentives on their job satisfaction. But you cannot just look at those that have incentives and say, oh, they are happy with their job or so and so. Are there differences between those that get incentives and those that do not get incentives? So that's the issue. There is a repeated measure, repeated collection of data when it comes to the cohort study. But in the other case, there is no, the data is predefined. The data is already there. You pick, so I've forgotten to mention this. The causal comparative, some books say is the same as the ex post facto research design, where mostly you base your analysis on secondary data. Okay, then the issue about the quasi-experiments, where you have to use UCC and UEW students. Are you still doing random selection and random assignments? First of all, you have to ask yourself as the researcher, what is my interest? What phenomenon am I working on? If it is not something based on departmental basis, on college levels, so and so, but it is the general students. When you go to UEW, definitely you will do random selection, because you cannot just look at the faces of the individuals and say, come and join my study. Because you have not, your study is not towards a particular group of people. For example, if my study is about geography students, level 200 geography student, you see, I go to level 200 geography student, both in UEW and UCC, and I know that I am using level 200 geography student. But when that sample is not defined, it is just UCC student and UEW student, and we want to bring an intervention. So UEW becomes the experimental and UCC becomes the control. In that case, when you go to UEW, you still have to go and select participants for your study, the same thing in UCC. In that case, there is random selection. That's why I said, in some cases for quasi-experimental, there is the issue about random selection. So it's not in all cases that there is no random selection. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Christian. If there are more questions,
yes, or if there are top-up questions,
yeah,
we can.
there's a follow-up question. You can come in and ask, please. Okay, so Mr. Philip, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure. Hello. Yeah. First, please, can you clarify again for me the last slide? You made mention of the three types of the causal comparative. So I want the exploratory. What's the difference between the exploratory effect and then the exploratory consequence? Yeah. Hello.
Hello, Mr. Philip.
Yeah, let's go on.
Yeah. I wanted to ask. I don't know if
your question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
So, Mr. Christian, please, you can take this question and then.
Okay. So with the effect, you see, I said exploration of effects. In this case, we want to see, I want to come up with an example that we can align a variable to have either a direct effect on another variable. In this case, it will be in two groups. So, as I said, the example I gave about students who take extra classes and students who do not take extra classes. The research question might be, what is the effect of students, or what is the effect of extra classes on students' academic performance? So in this case, if you are doing a causal comparative, you are going to select students who take extra classes and students who do not take extra classes and compare their performances to see the extent to which those either taking part in extra classes or not affect their performance. But for the consequence, there is a pre-existing variable that we want to explore and see to what extent does that variable, so we are looking at the end result. So the issue about you are taking alcohol, okay? What are the consequences? So we pick those who take alcohol and those who do not take alcohol, then we study them. As we study them, we are looking at changes in their behaviors, observing them. So in this case, what is the ripple effect of one variable on their behavior as the time goes? So you come up and do this analysis. Am I answering your questions as you please, or you have a follow-up question?
Hello, Mr. Robert.
I think he's muted. Yeah, please, Mr. Robert, talk.
Yeah, hello.
Yeah.
Sorry, let me find out from Sir whether you could help with this one. So, for example, if you are trying to do this kind of research, maybe experimental one, and then you have probably your sample size, maybe you have, for example, let me just give an example. Maybe you are picking samples from the same area, but different at different points, by the same sample location.
Example.
I want to find out, I don't know whether, not to derail him, whether you know of a statistical instruments that can be used for such issues.
You want to select a sample.
Yes,
so
so
let's say
like you have a sampling point or sample location.
Okay.
But you are sampling maybe 4 different points in the same location, the same sampling location, but different sites.
Okay.
So the locations are more. Probably you have maybe 4, 5, 6 sampling locations, but in each location you are taking about 3 or 4 sampling sites in the same location. I don't know if.
So let me give an example so that you can continue with your question. So if we come to central region, right?
Okay.
We want to use people in central region. But in central region, we have metropolises. So we have the KEA, we have the Cape Coast Metropolis, and then we have the Abra, Asamankesi Metropolis. So those 3 metropolis. In those 3 metropolis, there are towns in the metropolis, right? And then we have to select individuals from some of those towns for the study. Is that not what you mean?
Yes.
So now continue with your question.
So what I want to know, maybe I don't know, what is the best statistical instrument can you use in that in doing those stuffs?
Okay, your question, I think, first of all, you are talking about selection, but not measurement. The measurement, the statistical, what's the name? The statistical protocols for measuring or collecting data comes after the selection. So let's be specific. Are you talking about the selection or measurement?
No, the selection has been done. So that's like you have selected the sampling points around a particular sample locations.
Okay.
And then you have done those measurements, like you have gone for those samples. In this case, I'm very off from education area.
Okay.
So in that case, what is the best? If you can help me, I don't know. What would be the best statistical instrument or tools to use in kind of
analyzing that data?
Yes,
okay, that's fine. So if you are coming from an education aspect, it means you have students in these 3 metropolises, right? Now we ask ourselves, is our focus on the students in the metropolis or the students in the schools itself? If it is students in the metropolis, then we want to do a comparative analysis of the 3 metropolises. So, and see what is happening among the 3 metropolis. So in this case, we will need an ANOVA analysis because the students are categorized into 3 metropolis. And if it is, let's say, their performance we are measuring, then we use a one-way ANOVA where we will compare the student origins, that is the metropolis, against or on their performance to see, when you come to Cape Coast Metropolis, their performance is different from that of the KEA. Then the descriptive will tell you whether KEA, what's the name, in the differences in the performance, whether KEE has performed better or UCC Cape Coast has performed better when the 2 are compared. So the ANOVA is not just a straightforward statistical tool. After you have run your first analysis and you determine that there are differences in these 3 metropolises, you need to conduct a post hoc test. And this post hoc test will tell you, when you pick metropolis A and metropolis B, there is the difference between A and B, but A's performance is higher than B. When you pick C and A, there is no difference between C and A. So ANOVA in its entirety will tell you there are differences or there are no differences. Now, where there are differences, it does not tell you oh, A, B, C are different from each other. That's why after the handover, when there is a difference, you conduct a post hoc test to know where the differences are occurring.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Christian. So we take our final questions from
Okay.
Fatau and
Aduke.
Madam Sweet Aduke. So, Mr. Fatau, if you can hear me, can you go on with your question?
Mr. Fatau Suli, that's fine.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes,
sure,
sir.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you very much. I actually appreciate this evening presentation. But I want you to throw more light on the Quiza experimental, where you talked about the group assignment and group selection, random selection, random assignment.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, in the Quiza experimental. So I was not too clear about it. So I want to find out whether in Quiza experimental, do you do a group assignment? And how do you do that? And then when you have to do random selection, how do you do that?
All right.
Thank you. Let's take the last one.
Okay, so I think Mr. Robert's hand is still up.
Madam Edukwe.
Madam Aduke.
Yes.
Okay, Madam Aduke. Hello, Madam Aduke, can you hear me?
Thank you. Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Yes, please go on with your question.
Okay, I would want you to share the slides on data collection. So I asked my question from there.
Okay. Okay. I think you can see now. Madam Edukwe, please, is this what you're asking?
Hello, Madam Aduke.
Yeah. Where you have the cohort and the something type of data collection or something.
I have what?
The cohorts and some 3 types of
Yes, I think I get it. When it comes to the...
Is it a data collection or something?
No, it's with the longitudinal study.
Yeah, the longitude.
Okay.
No. It looks like from the presentation place, the cohorts. Yeah, the trend cohorts plus the panel, they are all talking about collecting the data over a period of time. They are all similar to me. Can you make a distinction among
The trend and what?
The trend, cohort and panel, all the three studies, they are all collected over a period of time. So if there's a clear distinction between the 3, how to differentiate them, I'll appreciate. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So starting with yours, I will give an explanation so we see how it plays out. When you take the trend studies, a general definition is that there are different samples from a population whose members may change, okay, or are surveyed at different points in time. Then when you take the panel, it says that the researcher surveys the same sample of individuals at different times during the course of the survey. So in panel studies, the individuals are not changing. I hope you get it. That is why you have the repeated measuring of what? A group over a period of time. But when you take the trend, there is a population and individuals in that population might be changing, even though you are collecting data on one phenomenon. So let's say WASI performance of students. Every year, there are different students that pass through the WASI system. Every year, different students, right? But at the end of the day, what do? We try and compare the performances of these students on a trend to see how are they performing, even though the samples are different for each year. But when you come to the panel studies, the sample is the same throughout your whole study. Please, do you get it? Hello?
Yeah, Mr. Christian, thank you.
I want to know if she got it before we continue.
Okay, so Madam Adukwe.
Yeah, you explained the cohort, the panel and trends.
Yes.
The cohort.
Good. So for this cohort, these groups of individuals are identifiable with a particular characteristic. Okay, so you as the researcher, you follow this group of people, collecting data on them, observing changes in their behaviors. So you want to say, oh, is this not the same as the panel studies where the data is collected on the same people over a period of time? Here, they might be similar, but not all the same, because when you take the cohort studies, for the same sample, there are individual groups under the same sample. Okay, so we have the sample of those that have issues about heart diseases. Now, those that have issues about heart diseases, when you go to this community, how are they playing out? When you go to this also community, what are their behaviors, especially responding to treatment and all that? So their characteristics are the same, but they have what? Different cohorts at different times. So in this case, literature will tell you that here you follow a particular group of individuals who share a common characteristics in the name of maybe a disease over what? An extended period of time. And the issue about random selection and random assignment in quasi experimental studies. Let's start with the example of the first, let me see, the fourth person's question on the, when you go to UCC and UEW and you want to conduct a quasi experimental study. In most cases, I said that people want to distinguish between the quasi and the true experimental with the issue of randomization, where they sometimes say that for quasi-experimental, there is no issue about random selection, but there is always random assignment. Random selection is the processes you go through to select your study participants. And random assignment is the processes you go through to divide or to decide which of the participants go into a control group or an experimental group. But because when we come to quasi-experimental design, we are now classifying groups, but not individuals. So when you go to UEW, all the students you select become a group for UEW. When you come to UCC, all the students you select become a group for UCC. Now you decide, do I place those students from UCC as the experimental group and place those students from UEW as the control group, or the vice versa? So in this case, instead of selecting, oh, sample A, let's say Kofi, go to the experimenter, Ama, go to the control group. It is not possible in quasi-experimental designs. So when you go to quasi-experimental, I stated it categorically that I want, here you will see for the true experiment, random assignment is at the individual level. So we pick individuals and say, go here, go here, go here, until we have our experimenter in control. But when we come to the quasi, it is at the group level where we decide which group falls under experimental and which group falls under the control group without looking at the individuals in the group. So we are taking the group as one entity. Please, are you okay with that? There is a follow-up question so that we address it. Mr. Please, you can unmute. Mr. Fatal. Moderator.
Yeah, I think, is it Mr. Fatal?
I want to know if he is clear about that.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
hello. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you, sir.
Yeah. I'm okay. I'm not clear. I'm very clear.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. So that will be our final question for today's episode. So hopefully we'll continue next week, same time, same day. And Mr. Christian, if you have anything, your final words.
Thank you so much for coming. I had wished that we delved more deep into the statistical analysis for some of these designs, as one of our participants brought out, where we were talking about the ANOVA, but I'm very sure that GRASAG executives are making everything possible for that session, that face-to-face session, to come alive. Then we can now take you through some of these analyses based on which design and what kind of research question or hypothesis you are analyzing. Then that one, it becomes practical, where you yourself, you play with the softwares in the data analysis. So for now, bear with us or bear with me if I don't go deeply into the statistical analysis session. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Christian. It looks as if there's one
someone raised their hand.
So, let's take it and end the session. Mr. Dangbui, Mr. Mauku.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Hello, we can hear you.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We have enjoyed the presentation and we have learned a lot from the presentation. But my problem is the network over the nation. The network problem is affecting all those who are not on campus right now as the presentation is going on. So it is just breaking. It affects our understanding, deep understanding into the whole show. But the few that I take, I think I'll work with it. So I would like to say thank you for that.
Oh, okay. Mr. Malco, thank you very much. But then we always make the recording available after every session. I don't know if you are on the
in addition to that, sometimes if maybe you are going through the presentations, the slides, and there is any issue you might want more clarifications on, you can contact us. Okay.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yes, sir. We can hear you.
Yeah, you made an intervention. I couldn't hear you.
Yes, I was saying that if you are going through the slides or the presentation and there is an issue that is still bothering you, need more clarification on, you can call us. I mean, our WhatsApp numbers are there. You can call us for more clarification, okay?
Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate you.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, so we appreciate your participation this evening, and we hope to see you next week, same time, same day. Have a good night, you.
You too.